Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into, well, a really unique collection of material. It's notes, remarks, conversations,
Yeah.
all capturing the spontaneous thought of Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Exactly. This isn't his polished work, the stuff he prepared for publication. It's more like glimpses into his mind while it was working.
Right. And the sources mentioned, sometimes you need a bit of indulgence because it is a bit formal.
Sure, but it's always packed with what they call worthy interest. Absolutely fascinating stuff.
Totally. So think of this deep dive as our way to sort of shortcut into understanding this incredible mind, constantly making connections, across literature, philosophy, religion, politics, life itself.
Our mission really is to unpack those surprising facts, those views that might challenge you, and those real aha moments that are just scattered throughout his reflections.
We're talking about insights from a thinker who, as the sources put it, laid foundations so deep.
And approached big questions in a truly original manner. So yeah, get ready for a journey into the lively, maybe sometimes messy, but always brilliant landscape of Coleridge's thinking.
Okay, let's get into this. The source material really hits home how hard it was to actually capture Coleridge's thought live as it happened.
Yeah, it wasn't about just jotting down quick, pithy remarks or, pointed anecdotes.
Really?
Not at all. These weren't sound bites. His thinking apparently unfolded in what the sources call long-drawn, subtle discoursing.
So to record it properly, the person listening had to basically do the work of thinking the argument over again themselves.
Right. Just to keep up. It was active listening on a whole other level.
Wow. Imagine trying to follow these splendid masses of reasoning as they're forming right in front of you.
And it's quite poignant, actually, because the notes mention that while his intellectual powers stayed sharp, completely unaffected by illness,
His mind was fine.
his mind was absolutely fine, but the reluctance and shrinking from action, just the sheer effort needed to, write these thoughts down himself, that was immense.
Yeah, it really highlights that internal struggle, doesn't it? This incredibly active mind, but a real resistance to the physical act of writing it all down.
It does, and we see the uniqueness of that mind straight away in one of his really core ideas.
Yeah.
That sharp distinction he drew between reason and understanding.
Yes.
That's fundamental. It really unlocks a lot of his thinking.
Okay, let's maybe put a pin in reason and understanding for just a second, because his views on literature are just as revealing, I think. He had such a deep, deep appreciation for poetry.
Yeah.
Especially Shakespeare.
Oh, absolutely. Coleridge saw Shakespeare's language as something, well, unique isn't even strong enough, entirely his own, he said, belonging of no age.
Meaning it wasn't just Elizabethan English.
Exactly. It was a language forged by Shakespeare's own intellect, transcending his time.
And I love that point about how Shakespeare used his bold villains, like Edmund and Lear. Characters like that could voice opinions, speculations that were maybe too dangerous or controversial for a wise character to say directly.
It was a way to explore the darker corners, the more challenging ideas, wasn't it? And the sources say he even thought he saw Shakespeare's hand in parts of Hieronymo.
Which tells you how intimately he felt he knew that unique Shakespearean voice.
Definitely. So if Shakespeare was that kind of timeless, natural genius of language, Milton was different. Coleridge pointed to Milton's artificial collocation of words, a very deliberate, almost architectural beauty in his phrasing, highly crafted. He also felt Milton's powerful egotism wasn't just in Satan.
Right, everyone sees it in Satan.
Yeah, but Coleridge saw it even in Milton's Adam, which is quite a take.
He really had a sharp eye for the specifics of different poets. Spenser, for instance, he loved the epithalamion and prothalamion, called them sublime, exquisite.
But he also noted Spenser's almost painfully minute attention to meter, like obsessive focus.
And Wordsworth. He specifically picked out the first two books of The Excursion, wished they'd been published on their own as The Deserted Cottage.
Considered it one of the most beautiful poems in the language, yeah. You can see his critical mind at work constantly, even in these off-the-cuff remarks.
He could draw these really sharp contrasts, too, like seeing Dryden as a genius that catches fire by its own motion.
Very different from Pope in his view.
Or comparing Homer's epic style, which he saw as purely external, completely objective,
Right.
with Pindar's odes, which he found the most artificial and highly wrought composition in all of Greek literature.
He did the same thing with dramatic style. He put Massinger at one end of the spectrum, almost conversational,
Okay.
and Milton-Sampson agonistes at the other, extremely elevated, artificial diction.
And Shakespeare.
Shakespeare was the perfect midpoint, master of the whole range, able to move between those extremes effortlessly.
That makes sense. And it ties into his bigger ideas about style, right? That artificial collocation of words wasn't just description.
No, it was recognizing the poet's deliberate craft. He saw how styles changed over time, too, contrasting the cavalier slang that became fashionable after the Restoration
Right.
with the much more formal Latinate Johnsonian style that came later.
And he had this really interesting idea about needing unity of impression in poetry.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
That's why he argued you can't really read too much of a poem like Butler's Hudibras all at once,
Why is that?
because each bit is brilliant on its own, full of wit, but they don't really fuse together. There's no single accumulating effect on your mind as you read through the whole thing.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about the individual lines, but how they build something larger for the reader.
Exactly. And his insights went right down to the mechanics of language itself. He thought Greek was just incredibly perfect as a language, pointing out things like the dual number or the neuter plural taking a singular verb. He felt these grammatical features actually reflected deep truth about, like, multiplicity versus plurality, or the nature of things versus persons.
Wow. He saw a real sympathy, as he put it, between Old Greek and Latin and English.
Yeah. And then amidst all this high-level stuff, there's this wonderfully human specific moment caught in the notes.
No.
The time the famous actor John Philip Kemble corrected Coleridge's pronunciation.
No. How?
Apparently Coleridge pronounced oblige as oblige, and Kemble, being this stickler for proper speech, said something like, "It would become your royal mouth better to say, oblige me."
That's brilliant. Brings him right down to earth, doesn't it?
It really does. A little touch of reality.
From grand theories of language to getting called out on a vowel.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's circle back then to that really foundational philosophical idea we mentioned earlier.
Reason and understanding.
Exactly. This is absolutely core to his whole system of thought, and it directly affects how he sees us processing information, knowledge, everything.
He used it to explain the relationship between principles and facts, didn't he? His point was that facts by themselves are basically useless.
Right. Useless without an antecedent light, a guiding principle of selection. He had that great analogy.
The lantern.
Yeah, the lantern. Imagine you're walking around a dark room full of objects. Those are the facts. Without the lantern, which is the principle, the guiding idea from reason.
You can't see them, can't organize them, can't make any sense of them.
Precisely. Understanding deals with the facts, the appearances, the stuff the lantern illuminates, but reason provides the deeper constitutive principles, the light itself.
He applied this to logic, too. He understood traditional syllogistic logic. He defined it quite neatly as seclusion, inclusion, conclusion, relating it to understanding, experience, and reason. But he felt the really important part, the bit that was neglected, was the criterional logic, the logic of the premises themselves. Like, how do we even arrive at our starting points or principles?
That's a much deeper question. And his view of Greek philosophy sort of follows this pattern. He saw it moving from physics, studying the outside world, towards deeper questions. But he felt it ultimately kind of degenerated into theurgy, a sort of mysticism or magic, when it lost touch with true reason.
And that famous contrast he drew, Aristotle versus Plato.
Yeah. Aristotle, the lord of the understanding, brilliant at organizing knowledge, but sometimes, Coleridge thought, he confounded science with philosophy.
Whereas Plato?
For Plato, ideas are constitutive. They're not just concepts, they're foundational realities. Plato engaged with reason, representing a higher state of thought.
Which leads us perfectly into his theology, where that reason-understanding split is absolutely crucial.
Definitely. Take the Trinity, for example. He didn't see it as something the understanding could ever logically puzzle out or explain.
Right, it's beyond rational grasp in that sense.
Exactly. He saw it as an absolute truth that transcends human understanding, something apprehended instead by reason. His own insight, he felt, wasn't in explaining the mystery, but in grasping why it was impossible for the understanding to grasp.
His Bible interpretations are often quite surprising, too, because he applied this really rigorous, almost philosophical lens. He argued St. John, in his writings, had a twofold object.
Which was?
To prove both the divinity of Christ and his real, actual humanity, not just one or the other.
And he'd dive right into the Greek text. Like his analysis of the word prose in John 1.1, the word was with God. He suggested it meant the utmost possible proximity without confusion. Two distinct beings brought as close as conceivable without merging into one. That level of detail.
And remember his reading of John 19.11, where Jesus tells Pilate his power comes from above.
Yeah, most people read that as divine authority.
Right. But Coleridge read from above as meaning from the Sanhedrin, the Jewish High Council.
You're kidding, really?
Yeah. His take was that Pilate, as the Roman governor in that specific context, derived his earthly authority from the Sanhedrin's prior judgment or sanction. Jesus was recognizing that political reality.
Wow. That's a very different reading. Almost legalistic.
It is. And he saw St. Paul's writings as showing this intricate Greek logic, contrasting it with St. John's style, which he saw as more oriental in its logic, more about position and association.
Interestingly, he also felt that the literal historical accuracy or genuineness of certain books, like Moses or Daniel, wasn't actually essential to Christian belief itself.
Where did he locate belief then?
More internally, within a man, as he put it, tied more to that inner resonance we talk about.
He certainly didn't hold back from criticizing religious views he disagreed with, like the superstitious notion of the Eucharist.
Right, which he partly blamed on the rash use of figurative language by some early church fathers like Chrysostom, even though he admired Chrysostom's eloquence generally.
His view of the fall of man is also pretty striking. He saw it as a creation of the non-living, kind of like a negative creation, introducing a principle of non-being or death into the world. And because of that, a redemptive process was necessary and constantly at work, trying to fix these anomalies and restore things. Not just a one-off historical event, but an ongoing reality. That connects to how he defined faith and belief, doesn't it?
Exactly. Faith, for him, was recognizing a deep correspondency, his word, between the core ideas in Scripture and your own innermost nature.
So the feeling that Christian doctrines somehow align with the fundamental structure of your own reason, your will, your understanding.
Yes. It's that internal click of recognition. He even applied this analytical thinking to the supernatural.
Like his definition of a ghost.
Yeah, a vulgar ghost, he specified, is defined by visibility without tangibility. Very precise.
And he had that psychological explanation for seeing both a real person and their phantom at the same time during a morbid delusion.
Right, suggesting it's the eye of the imagination and the physical eye perceiving simultaneously, but not quite aligning.
And speaking of the supernatural, his take on the Witch of Endor story is pure Coleridge.
Oh, yeah.
He basically suggested the whole thing was a trick of ventriloquism, maybe even staged by Saul's own nervous courtiers.
Ventriloquism.
Yeah. He pointed out the text doesn't actually say Saul saw Samuel's spirit. It only says the woman claimed she saw him and described him.
That's brilliant. Applying textual analysis and psychological skepticism to a biblical miracle story.
Exactly. And he had strong opinions, often critical ones, about various religious figures and groups.
He called Jeremy Taylor a Chrysostom for his amazing style, but then argued that Taylor's big work advocating tolerance, the liberty of prophesying, actually, if you followed its logic, implied the need for some kind of positive jurisdiction on earth to settle endless religious debates.
So, ironically, supporting the need for something like a pope.
That was Coleridge's reading of the logical outcome, yeah. He discussed Luther, Baxter, Hooker. He suspected Chillingworth might have secretly been a Socinian.
He described the Jewish religion, rather pointedly, as having light but no heat.
Meaning intellectual clarity, perhaps, but lacking spiritual warmth or passion, in his view.
And his critique of the dissenters of his day, especially the political ones, was pretty harsh.
Yeah, he felt their hatred to the church was often a stronger motivation for them than their actual love for Christianity itself.
And he saw Socinian logic, which denied things like the Trinity and original sin, as inevitably leading to the conclusion that there's really no such thing as sin at all.
He wasn't impressed. He also thought Quakerism had degenerated from its origins, and even questioned if William Penn actually believed in the historical Christ.
Wow, strong views. But despite all that, he kept insisting on the vital importance of studying the Bible.
Absolutely, not just for the core doctrines like sin and original sin, which he thought were crucial.
But also for style.
Yes. He genuinely believed that intense study of the Bible would prevent any writer, whatever their topic, from ever developing a vulgar or poor writing style.
It's another reminder, isn't it? For Coleridge, everything was connected. Theology, philosophy, language, style. It all fit together in his mind.
Totally. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. His commentary on the state, on society, human nature, equally forceful.
Yeah, and this is where some of his ideas feel maybe particularly challenging or surprisingly relevant, even now. He identified these two principles in every European and Christian state.
Permanency and progression.
Exactly. Stability and change. He saw things like the English Civil Wars as a struggle between these two essential forces that have to somehow be balanced.
And his view on democracy, well, it's quite different from how we usually think about it today.
How so?
He didn't see democracy as such like direct rule by the people as a proper element in the constitution of a state.
So not part of the formal structure.
Right. He saw it more as the vital, healthful lifeblood which circulates within the system, supporting it, keeping it alive, but he thought it ought never to appear externally.
Interesting. So that underlying energy, but not the visible form of power.
Kind of, yeah. And he drew this really stark contrast between the idea of a state and the church.
Okay.
The state, he argued, inevitably has to look at classes based on external accidents. Things like property, birth, status.
Right, practical realities.
Whereas the church, ideally, should disregard all those external things and look at individuals based purely on internal merit, their wisdom, their learning, their holiness. They operate on totally different principles when viewing people.
He was pretty scathing about the politics of his own era, wasn't he?
Oh, incredibly so. He called the Great Reform Bill preeminently wicked.
Wicked. Why?
Because he felt it deliberately inflamed public passions and basically played on ignorance to achieve its aims, and he thought it reduced the king to just a puppet.
And wasn't there that infamous description of the Catholic Emancipation Act?
Ah, yes. He called it a Suriname toad.
Which means?
The Suriname toad carries its eggs on its back, and they hatch into little toads there. So he meant the act would inevitably spawn lots of further multiplying problems down the line. A very vivid, if harsh, image.
His assessment of the House of Commons at the time was brutal, too.
Absolutely savage. He saw it becoming low, vulgar, meddling with everything, flattering every base passion, and sneering at everything noble.
Doesn't sound like he was a fan of the direction things were going.
Not at all. And he was deeply critical of the emerging field of political economy, especially what he called the Malthusian tendency.
What bothered him about it?
He felt it tried to denationalize everything, reduce society and human relations to just cold, impersonal market forces. He argued the true price of, say, a manufactured good shouldn't just be the cost of materials and labor.
What else should it include?
It should also factor in the potential demoralization and discontent it might cause among the workers or in the wider community. It was a direct challenge to purely economic ways of calculating value.
His view on a national debt was also quite unconventional.
Yeah, he called it a juggle.
Meaning it was fake.
Not exactly fake, but he argued it wasn't a real burden in the way most people thought, because the nation essentially owes the debt to itself, to its own citizens who hold the bonds. It's an internal circulation of wealth, not like owing money to a foreign power.
A different perspective.
Yeah.
Did he comment on foreign affairs?
He did. He could be very critical of British actions, too. He called England's conduct towards King William of Holland in one specific instance base and unprincipled. He judged actions based on principle, not just national interest.
And he had thoughts on the United States.
Some observations on Americans being rather preoccupied with themselves. He mentioned a critical book by a Captain B. Hall, and he definitely noted the stark contradiction of a nation preaching democracy while upholding slavery.
He touched on social things, too, like the English gentlemanly character.
Yeah, its origins and nature. He had views on marriage, the need for parental control up to age 21, apparently, even weighed in on whether cousins should marry.
And he saw trying to better your own condition in life.
Not just as okay, but as a natural and imperative duty. A moral obligation, almost.
What about slavery itself? A huge issue, then.
He had a nuanced view on guilt, which is important to state carefully. He argued an individual owner who inherited slaves might not necessarily be guilty in the same way as the slave trader who sold them, or the legislator who created and maintained the system.
So distinguishing levels of responsibility.
Yes. And looking at the New Testament, he noted it didn't explicitly command abolition, but focused more on regulating the relationship between masters and slaves within the existing system. He seemed to see this as divine providence working gradually through existing social forms, rather than demanding immediate, potentially chaotic upheaval.
That's complex. What about Sunday observance?
His view was quite practical. He argued for laws prohibiting compulsory labor and public entertainments on Sundays.
Why? For religious reasons.
Primarily, he argued, to protect the poor. to guarantee them at least one day of rest that their employers couldn't force them out of. But he was fine with private activities. He disliked strict Sabbatarianism, but also thought it was hypocritical to stop public coaches while letting the wealthy drive their private carriages around.
He criticized big financial prizes or rewards within the church, didn't he?
Yeah, he didn't think they actually went to the most meritorious clergy, but he strongly defended the idea of a national church.
On what ground?
He saw it as a vital germ of civilization for the whole country, crucial for circulating property and knowledge throughout society, not just a religious institution.
And he made that interesting point about arts funding.
Oh, yeah. That the darkest despotisms on the continent had actually done more to support and elevate the fine arts than the comparatively free English government.
The lack of appreciation in England, he felt.
A lack of deep general reverence for things like music and painting compared to places like Italy or Germany. Yes, he even offered critiques of specific painters. Rubens he described as having a libidinous nature, where the animal triumphed over the spiritual.
Strong nerds.
Contrasting him with someone like Reynolds just shows how his critical thinking applied everywhere.
It really does. His mind just seemed to range over everything, constantly connecting, evaluating. Okay, let's maybe turn now to some of his more personal reflections. Thoughts on genius, life, himself.
Sure, he had his own ways of categorizing people's minds. He made this distinction between keenness and subtlety in men of genius.
And which did he value more?
Subtlety. He saw keenness as sharp but maybe narrow, whereas subtlety was deeper, more pervasive, able to grasp finer connections.
And there's that really striking, almost chilling anecdote about meeting Keats.
Oh, yes. Coleridge recounted shaking Keats's hand, and apparently he immediately turned to the person he was with and said, "There is death in that hand."
Wow. And this was early on.
Yeah, he noted this was before the signs of consumption, tuberculosis, were really obvious. Whether it was intuition or just incredibly sharp observation, it's quite something.
It is. He had vivid memories of his own childhood, too, right?
Oh.
Schooling.
He recalled the discipline at Christ's Hospital as being almost ultra-Spartan, and he remembered his master, Boyer, telling a crying boy something like, "Boy, the school is your family. All the rest of your relations are dead to you."
Harsh, but maybe formative in a way.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Another anecdote shows that typical Coleridge mix of minute detail and larger argument. He used the story of St. Paul being bitten by the viper in the Book of Acts to argue that the shipwreck must have happened on the island of Melita in the Adriatic, not modern Malta.
Why? Based on what?
Based on the fact that apparently poisonous snakes were common in the Adriatic location, but very rare on Malta itself, using a detail of natural history to argue about biblical geography.
That's him all over, isn't it? Finding connections everywhere.
Absolutely. And he found a perfect illustration for the ignorance you sometimes find in high office in that famous Latin saying by Oxenstiern.
Remind me.
Nescis mi fili, quam parva sapientia regitur mundus is. You do not know, my son, with how little wisdom the world is governed.
Ah, yes. Something he probably felt keenly after dealing with officials, maybe during his time working for the government in Malta.
Quite possibly. And then there are these really deep reflections on human experience, his definition of love, for instance.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It really is. Starting as a desire for supplement and completion, needing the other person, then evolving into a quiet, perpetual seeking, and finally settling into this confirmed faith in the nobleness of humanity inspired by the beloved. It traces a whole journey.
It's fascinating to place that alongside another, maybe more provocative point captured in the notes.
Which one?
His thought that a woman's desire, or maybe her conscious awareness of her desire, is rarely other than for the desire of the man.
Ah, yes, that's certainly a challenging statement from the source. Reflective of the time, perhaps, but it definitely makes you pause.
It does. He also offered a very clear distinction between genius and talent.
How did he separate them? Talent, he thought, lives mostly in the understanding. It's often something you can inherit, like a skill. Genius, though, is the active power of reason and imagination working together.
And it's not usually inherited.
Rarely inherited, he thought. And its key characteristic is the ability to present familiar things in a completely new way, making you see them fresh again, awakening a freshness of sensation.
And he had that rather detached view of how a genius relates to vulgar people.
Yeah, almost humorous. He apparently said they're just objects of amusement of another race altogether, as if the genius is observing them from a different plane entirely.
A bit aloof.
Maybe. He also strongly agreed with that ancient idea, the one attributed to Strabo and echoed by Ben Jonson.
That a great poet has to be a good man.
Exactly. He argued the poet's heart must be pure, must be self-aware. How else could he genuinely connect with and move the hearts of his readers?
Makes sense. And finally, that sharp observation about empathy.
Right. That generating sympathy and joy is actually much harder than exciting sympathy and sorrow.
We find it easier to connect over shared pain than shared happiness.
That seemed to be his feeling, yeah. We seem more naturally wired to commiserate than to purely celebrate with someone else.
Wow, that covers such an incredible amount of ground, doesn't it? From tiny details of grammar or pronunciation.
The way up to the nature of God, the state, genius itself.
Absolutely. This deep dive, drawing on these informal records, really gives you a feel for the sheer energy and breadth of Coleridge's mind just operating.
It's not a static portrait from a finished book. It's glimpses of a living intelligence grappling with pretty much everything in real time.
It really highlights why looking beyond the formal published works can be so valuable. You capture that process, those spontaneous connections, those sometimes raw opinions.
We really hope you found some intriguing points, maybe some of those aha moments yourself, in exploring all this with us.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final, pretty potent thought from these remarks, something Coleridge said that you can maybe chew on a bit.
If a man is not rising upwards to be an angel, depend upon it, he is sinking downwards to be a devil. He cannot stop at the beast.
A powerful, maybe stark view of human potential and the idea that moral life is constant movement up or down. There's no standing still.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.